When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Welcome back to our channel, History of Torture. Contrary to today's world, which is full of comfort, back in medieval times, torture was used to provide pleasure and entertainment to the king or the nobles in power. Today's prisoners that complain about the hospitalities and food provided should consider themselves lucky not to have been born in the medieval era of Rome. So let's get ready to explore some of the most brutal torture methods used in Rome. Ancient Rome and torture deaths. As far as we can trace back, torture was used to loosen the lips of witnesses to wring testimonies. While it was used as a form of punishment, it was also a form of entertainment for the emperor. Under Roman law, enslaved people could be tortured to extract evidence or get their slavery work done. According to the early records, torture as a technique of interrogation was seen in the context of the degree of physical suffering deemed appropriate for the accused depending on the crime committed. In the wake of committing a capital crime, the free persons were also sometimes executed in the same manner in front of the cheering public. No matter what, the Romans never hesitated before torturing a person to death. Techniques of torturous death. The breaking wheel. This torture technique originated in Greece and was then adopted by the Romans. The breaking wheel was one of the worst forms of punishment in ancient history, reserved for crimes of murder, robbing a church, treason, or rape. The breaking wheel extends its roots into the early modern period. The punishment was generally executed in public, also referred to as the Catherian wheel. The procedure of this punishment varied depending on region, time, and verdict of the crime. The primary goal of the breaking wheel was not death but torture. The victim was taken to a scaffold, tied to the floor naked, and strapped to the wheel, starting with the legs. The executioner used a large wheel with iron rims or sometimes additional spikes to drop the instrument on the shin bones and move up the arms of the victim. The naked victim's joints were placed on sharp-edged wooden blocks, and their extremities were shattered. The rhythm and number of beats during the execution were prescribed beforehand. Thick chunks of wood were placed under the knees, ankles, wrists, elbows, and hips. The procedure would sometimes be executed upside down, starting with the neck or heart of the victim. If the victim was strong enough to survive this torture, the executioners would increase the suffering, eventually leading to the victim's death. The body was left on the wheel to the scavenging animals. This was done with the belief that such scavenging would hinder life's transition from life to rebirth. The Romans showed no mercy. The YouTube insights were less brutal than the Romans, telling us that you only need to subscribe to our channel. Well, what are you waiting for? Hit the subscribe button straight away to stay updated with more interesting facts about ancient forms of torture. Punyakuli. People who were found guilty of patricide were generally executed with a punishment of Punyakuli. The procedure would begin with severely whipping the head of the victim with blood-colored rods. The victim's feet would be placed in wooden shoes or clogs and then covered with a leather sack. The victim was accompanied by live animals inside the bag, including a dog, snake, monkey, and sometimes a chicken or a rooster. The further procedure included throwing the live sack into a running stream of water with a hope that the live animals would attack the poor victim due to the fear of drowning, thereby ripping the victim's soul out. This technique was then scrapped, and an alternative for patricide was brought into the picture, wherein the victim was thrown to the beast to be eaten alive in the arena. But eventually, Punyakuli was brought into practice again in the 3rd century AD, with only the victim inside the sack. Oh my, the poor little slaves of Rome. The Brazen Bull. The Brazen Bull execution technique was created by the ancient Greeks, which again was adopted by the Romans later on. This form of punishment was slow, which portrayed mercifulness in front of a large audience. The Brazen Bull was also termed the Bronze Bull or the Sicilian Bull. The procedure was done with a bronze instrument, bull-sized, with an opening wherein the victim was pushed. A fire was lit under the bull until the man was slowly roasted to death. It, however, was made so that when the man agonized in pain, it appeared that an animal was howling, and it was the source of entertainment for the tyrant of Ergas in the form of a musical tone of a bull's pain. The bull's nose pushed out the smoke, which had a pungent smell of a roasting body. The bull's nose was filled with incense to overcome the smell problem, producing a mild scent. The leftover bones of the victim inside the instrument were used to make bracelets. Bracelets were later sold in markets and were available to the nobles. The Romans enjoyed the torture events to the extent that they experimented with new techniques on the victims to punish them severely for their entertainment. What we are going to see next will shock you. The next torture technique used by the Romans was known as pile driving. In pile driving, a wooden pole was sharpened on one side and the pile was prepared beforehand. The convict's legs were tied with rope, and the rope was tied to oxen or horses. The stake was then laid between the victim's legs and dragged by the animals. The pile dug deep into the victim's anus but could not pierce the body completely. The pole was then untied and placed vertically, and the bank sank deeper and deeper with the victim's body weight, hitting the victim's bowels. Sometimes the victim was set on fire and flames led to their torturous death. Well, ancient Rome was something else, wasn't it? People getting tied to ropes and their privates burnt off was quite sinister. And the punishment wasn't even the main issue either. The people, the executioners, the nobles, they all found this as a source of entertainment. And now let's move on onto one of the worst kinds of torture that has ever been created in the history of torture. Sit tight and stay calm. Rat torture. In this torture method, a bunch of rats were placed into a metal bucket or cylinder, which was then tied to the victim's body. Hot coals or a lit torch was then placed on the bottom of the bucket. The hot charcoals burned the victim while making the rats dig through their stomach in an attempt to escape the heat. So the rats would eat and dig inside the body to run away from the flames, which would lead to an agonizing death. Though it is not factually known whether the execution was stopped at the confession of the victim or led to their deaths, knowing what Romans usually did, we can only assume that they tortured the convict to the extent that they slowly died, with rats feasting on their flesh. Some forms of rat torture occurred in the form of live rats being inserted into the victim's genitalia through a tube. The tube allowed the rats to enter and eat the private parts. They stayed there even if they didn't eat. Some victims were placed in a room full of live rats overnight so that they could be eaten alive. Quite gruesome if you ask me. Oh, the Romans. They never shied away from executing humans with animals. All in front of a cheering public, no less. In ancient Rome, punishment was cruel and unusual. The enslaved woman could be physically assaulted. Brutal punishment was a lifestyle of the Romans. Apart from the punishments mentioned above, convicts were also punished by ripping out their tongues, cutting off their ears, being buried alive, putting out their eyes, and of course, crucifixion. Crucifixion was the most known form of punishment, and even Jesus Christ was made to go through it. The Romans lived in squalor, with their favorite pastime being brutal executions. They treated their prisoners horribly to reveal information. Ancient Rome is said to worship many gods and goddesses, and this is how they used to treat people they created. What irony. Rome may be civilized now, but its ancient history still haunts it today. 40% of Rome was inhabited by enslaved people treated as objects. The enslaved people had no legal protection and could be killed by their masters at any time. As stated earlier, do what the Romans do. They can no longer do what they did earlier. And that brings us to the ending of today's video. These were the brutal facts for today. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it entertaining. And if you did, do hit the like button, and while you're at it, subscribe to our channel, History of Torture, and hit the bell icon to stay up to date with our future uploads. Stay tuned.